Welcome back to episode 5 of the Origin of My Faith series, an 8-part series where I give you all the reasons that I have faith in God. Today we're going to try to answer the question, are the Gospels historically reliable documents? One of the biggest questions in all of history, but especially in all of theology and kind of religious studies, and of course everything that I believe hinges on the answer to that question. If they're not reliable historical documents, then you can't trust what's in them. And if they are reliable historical documents, then you can trust what's in them. And so I'm going to get most of my supporting evidence from a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And of course, I will cite all my sources. I'm going to put I've done a lot of research for this. I'm going to put all of the links in the description if you'd like to check any of this out for yourself. I'm not just going to give you information without backing it up a little bit here. Lee Strobel spent most of his career before he became an author. He spent it as a journalist for the Chicago Tribune. For undergrad, he received a journalism degree from the University of Missouri, and he got his master's in studies of law from Yale. So he went to Yale Law School, and so this man is very highly educated. He knows what he's talking about. And to kind of give you a little bit of history of the writing of this book, he spent most of his life as an atheist. Oh, maybe not most, but a majority of his life as an atheist. A big portion of his life. He believed God to be a product of wishful thinking, ancient mythology, and primitive superstition. He believed that evolution satisfactorily explained how life originated, and that scientific reasoning dispelled belief in the supernatural. As for Jesus, he believed that Jesus never even claimed to be God, which he very clearly does. He says, "My Father and I are one." He refers to himself as the Son of Man, which is quoting an Old Testament verse from Daniel, where the Messiah is referred to as the Son of Man. That's neither here nor there. Jesus, if you understand, Jewish theology, especially from the time, saying, "I and my Father are one," and referring to yourself as the Son of Man is very clearly implying that you're the Messiah. But he believed Jesus never claimed to be God, and that even a surface level look at the evidence would tell you that Jesus was just an unusually kind and wise human being like the rest of us. And that's kind of all he gave it for a while, a surface level look, until in 1979, his wife converted to Christianity. And after noticing kind of unexpected changes in her character, integrity, and personal confidence, and wanting to prove her wrong, he decided to launch an all-out investigation into the facts surrounding the case for Christianity and the resurrection. He wanted to kind of get to the bottom of it himself, and that's where this book comes from. So it is written from the perspective of him being a staunch atheist, hoping to disprove everything about Christianity to be incorrect. And he goes around and he interviews people trying to get them to slip up, trying to get them to say something that proves his point. And so, obviously, I'm not going to go into everything that this book talks about. If you'd like to read it for yourself, again, the link will be in the description here. But he answers questions like, did Jesus really believe he was God? Was he crazy when he claimed to be God? Was he a crazy lunatic? Was the resurrection a hoax? And what verdict does all of this evidence allow us to reach? What is the takeaway here? And if you would like to answer those questions, if you would like the answer to those questions yourself, again, just go take a look into the book, because I'm here to specifically look into the historical reliability of the Gospels as documents that record the life of Jesus Christ. And so to do that, I would like to answer the following 4 questions. 1. Were the Gospels written with the express intention of recording history accurately? 2, were the Gospels written by the people who claim to have written them, and can they be trusted? 3, was the information in these books reliably preserved until it was written down? And 4, how does the New Testament compare to other historical events and documents? And so to answer these questions, we are going to look at 2 interviews from Strobel's book, one of which is an interview with a man named Craig Blomberg, who is widely considered to be one of the highest authorities on the biographies of Jesus, also known as the Gospels, in the United States. He has a doctorate in New Testament from Aberdeen University in Scotland. He has produced a series of acclaimed works on the life of Jesus, and at the time that this book was written, was a professor of New Testament at the Denver Seminary. With many of his works being on the historical reliability of the Gospels, he is a reliable and relevant person to turn to answer the questions that we have here today. The other interview that I'm going to reference in trying to answer those 4 questions is with a man named Bruce Metzger, who authored and edited 50 books on the New Testament, received a master's degree from Princeton's Theological Seminary. He received both a master's degree and a doctorate from Princeton University, honorary doctorates from 5 other colleges and universities across the world. And at the time of the writing of this book, he was a professor emeritus at Princeton Theological Seminary after a 46-year career teaching the New Testament. So clearly he is another great resource to help us get to the bottom of questions like these that we have here today. And so let's dive into question 1 here. Were the Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which tell the story of Jesus' life, written with the express intention of recording history accurately? And so what we want to get to the bottom of here is, were these books written for the purpose of entertainment? Were they written as the extension of some like mythological story, or were they actually intended to be historical documents? Were they written with the purpose of recording things that actually happened, or were they, were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were they writing a play? Like, what were they doing here? Why were they writing this? Essentially is what we're trying to get to the bottom of here. And so to answer this question, we look to Strobel's interview with Blomberg, where, when confronted with this question, turns to the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, which goes like this. He says, this is the very first verse in the book of Luke, chapter 1, verse 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So this makes it very clear that Luke is intending to write accurately about the things he investigated and found to be well supported by eyewitnesses. And so he says, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. I believe that's either a person's name or a title, so he's addressing this to somebody. So that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So that you can know that this stuff is real and you're not being punked, right? This introduction reads very similarly to how many other generally trusted historical and biographical works introduced themselves at the time. And while Matthew, Mark, and John don't have an introduction like this, they are very close to Luke in terms of content and genre, and so we can be reasonably assured that they are aligned in intention as well. And then when you look at the fact that these books are written with great detail, care, and specificity, and do not contain the outlandish and blatantly extravagant dramatization that a lot of other myths and ancient writings that we know to be purely written for entertainment do have. You see that the goal of these authors is very clearly an attempt to record what actually happened according to eyewitnesses. And so that brings us to our second question. We've established the intention of these writings, and so our second question would be, who are these authors and can they be trusted? Which is a very, very, very important thing to look at with any historical document. This question is also answered by Blomberg, who says, this is a direct quote, he says, "Strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous, but the uniform testimony of the early church was that Matthew, also known as Levi, the tax collector, and one of the 12 disciples, was the author of the first gospel in the New Testament. That John Mark, a companion of Peter, was the author of the gospel that we call Mark, and that Luke, known as Paul's beloved physician, wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, which is the book that directly follows the Gospels if you buy a full Bible in order like that." Blomberg goes on to say that there are no known competitors for these three Gospels, and apparently that it just wasn't even in dispute. It wasn't a question. There's no other names that have ever been attributed to these, and so from a historical standpoint, you can reasonably assume that those three people are the actual people who wrote these books. And so then that leaves us with one more. It leaves us with the Gospel of John. It's the only gospel with any sort of disputed authorship. And so, as with the other three, the early testimony of the church and anyone else you might want to reference there, it is unanimous that it was John the Apostle who wrote the Gospel of John, but there is one exception. A Christian writer named Papias, who wrote his testimony in about 125 AD, refers to both John the Apostle and John the Elder as having been the person to write this. But it's not exactly made clear if he's talking about one person with two different roles, like John the Apostle when he was younger became John the Elder when he was older, or if he's referring to these two people as different people. It's not exactly made clear. But overall, the vast majority of evidence and material goes back to John the Apostle. And so it is reasonable to assume that he is the author of this book. And so now we can look at the identity and credibility of each of these authors to find out, can we trust the things they're saying? So obviously Matthew and John were apostles of Jesus and direct eyewitnesses to the content that they write about. Mark, John Mark as they call him, was a companion of Peter, the man closest to Jesus during his life on earth, and was the founder of the first church. So again, a pretty, a companion of arguably the most important historical figure in all of Christianity, besides Jesus and maybe Abraham and Moses and some of those other guys, but he's up there. And then Luke was a beloved friend of Paul, who wrote the 13 epistles and is the most highly regarded early church leader outside of the 12 apostles. And so, now we have established that all of the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses or companions of eyewitnesses or trustworthy early church leaders. Let's look at the credibility of these people. So now we know that they have the ability to write the things they saw. They were there, or they knew someone that was there, or they were a part of a body that knew someone that was there. But let's look at their credibility. Can the things that they say and write about and claim, can those things be trusted? And so to do that, I would like to examine the character of these people. Are they the type of person that can be trusted? And two, the possibility of their susceptibility to bias, right? I think it is arguably one of the biggest arguments against the Gospels as a reliable historical document is that some people think these people were probably biased. And so we're going to get into that. First, let's talk about the character of these people. And so for that, we're going to go back to the interview with Blomberg here. Strobel asks him if there's any evidence of dishonesty or immorality that might taint their ability or willingness to transmit history accurately. And to which he responds, he says, "We simply do not have any reasonable evidence to suggest they were anything but people of great integrity. We see them reporting the words and actions of a man who called them to as exacting a level of integrity as any religion has ever known. In addition, they were willing to live out their beliefs despite persecution, deprivation, and suffering, which shows great character. In terms of honesty, in terms of truthfulness, in terms of virtue and morality, these people had a track record that should be envied." This very clearly tells us that these people followed a man who held them to a standard that meets or surpasses any other moral standard that existed. They were willing to uphold that moral standard despite persecution. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but persecution, torture, and death. They were willing to uphold that morality in the face of those things. And so that does kind of put these people on a level of moral character that not many people have really ever lived up to. And so now that we have established that these people do have good character, they do have trustworthiness, integrity, and virtue and morality, let's look at the possibility that maybe they were biased, and which I think is a completely fair thing to ask. So on this topic, Strobel says, "We can't underestimate the fact that these people loved Jesus." I mean, of course they did. They were not neutral observers. They were his devoted followers. Wouldn't that make it likely that they would change things to make him look good? Again, completely fair question to ask, and I think the answer here is incredible. Blomberg, he concedes that yes, it creates the potential for that to happen. Of course it does. But on the other hand, people can so honor and respect someone that it prompts them to record his life with great integrity. That's the way they would show their love for him, by recording his life honestly and not lying about someone they claim to care about. And as we know, these people are people of character, and so they're going to treat someone they care about with that level of integrity. And he goes on to say, besides, these disciples had nothing to gain except criticism, ostracism, and martyrdom. They certainly had nothing to win financially. If anything, this would have provided pressure to keep quiet, to deny Jesus, to downplay him, even to forget they ever met him. Yet because of their integrity, they proclaimed what they saw, even when it meant suffering and death. And so I would like to take a step away from The Case for Christ here, the book that I'm sourcing for a lot of my supporting evidence, and kind of talk about part of my own belief. And this what I've been talking about here is research I've done to support it. But what did kind of initially get me convinced that this was real is the reaction that a lot of the apostles had when faced with the possibility of torture and death for their beliefs. The eyewitnesses who saw these things and wrote them down, they were willing to die for what they believed to be true. Out of the hundreds of people who saw Jesus die, and days later claimed to have seen him alive, teaching about the kingdom of God, many of them died very gruesome deaths for their beliefs, and yet not one of them renounced their faith. Major argument against Jesus as the Son of God, as I've kind of referenced before, is that these people were lying, right? But people don't die. People don't die and accept torture for things they believe to be a lie. They don't do that. Peter was crucified upside down. James was cut down with a sword. John boiled alive in oil. Philip was beheaded. Bartholomew was flayed alive and then beheaded. Simon, insane, sawed in half. I mean, all they had to do to save their lives was either confess that they were lying or say that Jesus was not God. None of them did those things. And so we can reasonably assume that, one, they were not lying about their beliefs and that they believed Jesus was God. They were more afraid, listen to me, they were more afraid of denying the one true living God of the universe and so absolutely sure that their beliefs were correct that they were willing to die. They were more afraid of that and the consequences that come with that than being tortured and dying. So we can at least understand that they weren't lying about what they believed, and they were so sure about what they believed and what they saw with their own two eyes, because a lot of these people were at the crucifixion and saw Jesus after he was crucified. They were so convinced that that is truly what happened that they were willing to die for it. And I think that is one of the best supporting arguments for the reliability of what is written here, written in the Gospels, is that the people that wrote them weren't lying, and they were convinced to the point of sacrificing their life for it, which is absolutely incredible. And so, everything we've gathered together so far has portrayed the gospel writers as, one, they're who they claim to be. The author's name that is attached to these works is the actual identity of the person who wrote them. Two, they are good sources of an account of these events because of who they are. As we established, some of these people are eyewitnesses, very close companions of eyewitnesses, or part of the early church in a way that would give them access to reliable information. Three, they are people of good character. And four, they are unlikely to have been susceptible to bias. And so that brings us to question 3. Was the information in these books reliably preserved until it was written down? Important question, because there's a lot in these books. And it took a while for it all to get written down in the way we have it now. Is it possible that the story of Jesus was corrupted by faulty memories, wishful thinking, or the development of legends over time before it was all written down? And so our answer once again, comes from the interview with Blomberg, who emphasizes that much of the education and teaching in religious communities, these religious communities at the time, it was all done by word of mouth. They had an oral tradition. There were no computers, no printing press, and papyrus was rare and expensive. And so rabbis became famous for having the entire Old Testament committed to memory. So it would have been, well within the capacity of the disciples to have committed the contents and events of the Gospels to memory and to have passed it along accurately. I mean, when you look at the length of the Old Testament compared to the length of, you can throw in the entire New Testament in there if you want to, instead of just the 4 books of the Gospels. It's 3 or 4 times longer than the entire New Testament, which the Gospels I don't even make up 50% of. And so if you're looking at this and seeing that there are rabbis out there who have 10 to 12 times more information memorized just in their head, it is completely within reason to assume that the disciples here could have Jesus' words and the events of his life committed to memory as well. It's not out of the question even a little bit. And in addition to that, 80 to 90% of Jesus' words were originally in poetic form. He spoke in parables, he spoke in poetry. This doesn't necessarily mean rhyming, but they are said originally in a way that has meter, balanced lines, parallelism, etc., that would have made it much easier to remember. I mean, just think about the number of songs that you know all the words to. I bet you that you and I have the words to a certain number of songs memorized that outnumbers the number of words that are in all 4 books of the gospel. Especially if you're going just by like each book, 100%. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. It's very likely that these people could have memorized this and not even struggled a little bit. Strobel then goes on to make the comparison of this practice to a game of telephone, where by the end the original message is completely lost. And he asks Blomberg, he's like, is that not a fair comparison to make? I mean, these words were passed down for so long. How can you be sure that it wasn't corrupted by the time it got to the point where it was written down? Unfortunately for him, that analogy does not work very well, because in order for it to work, you would have to have every third person in the line of the game of telephone go back and talk to the first person in line to make sure that they still had the message right. And again, I guess that would kind of defeat the whole purpose of the game. But that's how the community worked at the time. There were checks and balances in place to make sure that messages weren't corrupted. And so, what you said would be monitored and corrected if it needed to be, and this would preserve the integrity of the message until it was eventually written down in the form we have it today. And that brings us to our last and arguably most helpful question in establishing the Gospels as a reliable historical account. Question 4, how does it compare to other historical records? How do they stack up? Spoiler alert, it stacks up very well. A big point of contention was that the Gospels, as we know them, weren't written down for 40 plus years after the life of Jesus. And so, that must corrupt the message and its accuracy, right? Fortunately, no, it doesn't. One reason for that is kind of the one that I just got done talking about. Our answer to the third question is that this was an oral tradition, and things were very reliably passed down, and they had checks and balances for making sure it was passed down without corrupting the message. Okay, so that's one reason why it's kind of unreasonable to assume that the message that we have today isn't the truth. And 2, because 40 years, it might sound like a lot to you and me, especially with our attention spans nowadays. 40 years from now, how could you possibly be able to trust something that was written that long after the events that took place? It's kind of nothing. No amount of time, essentially, compared to the vast, vast, vast majority of other historical documents. And for an example of this, I would like to look to the life of Alexander the Great, a historical figure that is not questioned very often in terms of are the events that we believe his life to have consisted of, are those events what actually happened? But then when you look at the earliest, this is closest to his existence, the earliest biographies of his life written by authors Arrian and Plutarch weren't written for more than 400 years after his death. And yet historians consider them to be generally trustworthy. And while embellished legendary content was eventually written about Alexander the Great, that didn't happen until hundreds of years after these other 2 more accurate writings, meaning that for the first 500 years of no information about this guy that is written down, at least, Alexander the Great's story was kept largely intact. John, the last written gospel, so the furthest from Jesus' life, is believed to have been written in the 90s AD at the very latest. A lot of people say earlier, but the most liberal, I don't mean liberal like American politics, I mean like free thinking, I guess. The most liberal sources kind of place this around 90 years. A lot of people place it earlier, but 90 AD at the very latest. And when you compare 60 years from 30 AD to 90 AD, the 60 years max gap there, to the 400 to 500 years of other historically trusted documents, not only does it stack up pretty well, it stacks up the best. And then, so the other comparison that I would like to make here isn't necessarily based on dating or timing of these copies of these manuscripts, but instead looking at the number of copies that we have. And for this, I know you guys have been waiting for them. We take our first look to the interview with Bruce Metzger. In the interview, Strobel brings up the fact that all we have are copies of the New Testament. We do not have the original documents. And so, that obviously brings in the question again, is what we have today what was originally written down? We've already covered oral tradition to first writing, but now we have to go from the first writing to the current living copy that we have today. And so Metzger responds to this by saying, this isn't an issue that is unique to the Old Testament. The vast majority, if not all historical documents from 2,000 plus years ago, we don't have the original copies of. And in fact, this topic actually helps the case of the New Testament because of the vast number of copies that we have. The more often you have copies that align with each other, that match up and agree and say the same thing, the more likely it is that you can tell what the original document actually said. And so there are copies of the New Testament, the Gospels, in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Gothic, Georgian, Ethiopic, and many other languages from within just a few generations of the originals. And so you can cross-check these with each other, and they all say the same thing, adding to the historical reliability of these documents compared to what the very, very first written version of the Gospels were. There are a little over 5,500 Greek manuscripts in total, 8,000 to 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 8,000 in Ethiopic, Slavic, and Armenian, putting the total just under 24,000 early manuscripts in existence. And so in terms of the multiplicity of manuscripts and the time gap between the originals and our first copies, we can have great confidence in the accuracy with which this material has been passed down to us, especially compared to other ancient literary work. As the late F.F. Bruce, eminent professor at the University of Manchester, England, and author of The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, once put it, there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. And guys, before we move on, I'd like to talk about that statement there. What he's saying, out of every historical document that we have, that we trust to tell good, honest stories about events that really did actually happen, the New Testament stands at the top. It is the most well documented, it is the earliest dated, and there is nothing else that even comes close. You can say that that's luck or coincidence or the force of religious doctrine if you'd like. That is a work of God, that it is as reliable as it is. And yet so many people still question it. They say they're not reliable, when in fact they are the most reliable. And so this gives us sufficient evidence to treat the Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which tell the story of Jesus, as a reliable, first-hand, primary account of the life of Jesus. They tell his story truthfully and honestly and as it really happened. And if we can't trust the Gospels to do that, we should throw every other historical document out the window. And so what do the Gospels say about his life? I mean, I think that's kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're trying to get to here. It tells four things that I'd like. There's a lot, but they tell us four things that I would really like to focus on. One, that Jesus claimed to be God. I and the Father are one. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. Jesus claims to be God. Okay? At least a claim. Bare minimum, he's a claim. 2, that Jesus lived a sinless life, that he never sinned, not once. 3, that he went around performing miracles. And we'll get into this later because even the biggest opponents of Jesus that say, no, he wasn't the Messiah, he wasn't God, even the people who deny that claim entirely still admit that he performed miracles, right? But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So he claimed to be God, he lived a sinless life, he performed miracles, and he died and he rose on the third day. And since those 4 claims are made by a source that I reliably trust to be true, I believe those claims. And since I believe that a sinless, miracle-performing, death-defying man claimed to be God, I believe his claim. So this far, I have presented the reason and evidence that supports my belief that 1, God exists, and 2, that Jesus being God is the most probable truth. The evidence does support that claim, but by no means, as I said at the very beginning, is that undeniable proof. Faith as a Christian concept would not need to exist if there was absolute proof. And so, I've gotten us a big portion of the way there. I've gotten us to the point where that is the explanation that makes the most sense. It is, in fact, faith that bridges the gap between probability and absolute certainty. And so let's get into part 3 here, an explanation of my faith. Thank you guys for watching episode 5 of the Origin of My Faith series. Come back tomorrow where I'm going to talk about the impact that Christ has had on the hearts of both myself and many others across the world. Homework before tomorrow is going to be to read Psalm 34 so you can learn a little bit about how God approaches the hearts of people who are struggling in the world. Thank you again, and God bless.